It was a typical Sunday afternoon in our home. The sun was shining brightly through the windows, casting a warm, golden glow over the dining room where a delicious smell wafted from the kitchen. My daughter-in-law, Maria, had invited her mother over for a casual visit, and the house was buzzing with activity. I could hear the sounds of conversation and laughter spilling into the air as everyone was preparing for a family meal. It had been some time since we all gathered in such a way, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia. The food, of course, was impeccable. Maria, ever the hostess, had outdone herself. Her mother was comfortably seated on the couch, a glass of wine in hand as my son, Alex, sat beside her, laughing at something Maria had just said. I was sitting at the corner, watching the scene unfold, feeling a little disconnected. I didn't want to admit it, but there was an uneasiness creeping in that I couldn't quite shake off. I had always been a part of the heart of this family, the one who kept everything together. I had cooked countless meals, hosted family gatherings, and made sure everything ran smoothly. But today there was something different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt invisible. Maria was moving between the kitchen and the living room, making sure her mother was comfortable, filling her glass with wine every so often. I noticed the way she doted on her mom, a sweetness in her actions that was unmistakable. It wasn't just the wine or the way she served her mother, but the entire manner in which she treated her, with an almost reverential care. I had to admit, it was endearing to watch her take such good care of her mother. Yet, as I watched, a quiet, unspoken feeling of discomfort began to settle in my chest. Everything seemed to be unfolding as I had expected. Maria was the perfect daughter-in-law, and her mother was the perfect guest. But then something happened. Something small but significant that would set the tone for the rest of the afternoon. Maria glanced over at me as she was moving toward the dining table, setting the wine bottle down beside her mother. "Mom will need the dishes done after we eat," Maria casually said, her tone light, almost offhand. At that moment, it was as though time slowed down. My mind immediately processed what she had just said, but the weight of the words didn't quite settle in at first. She hadn't asked if I wanted to help. She hadn't offered to share the task. Instead, it was simply an instruction, a casual demand. "Wash the dishes, Mom," it seemed to say. I watched as she turned away to attend to something else, as though that single sentence had been nothing more than a passing thought. My heart sank. It wasn't that I minded washing the dishes. I had done it countless times before without complaint. But something in the way she had said it, so nonchalantly, without any recognition of the fact that I, too, was part of the family, too, had been a caregiver, too, had contributed, stung deeply. It wasn't about the task itself. It was about the lack of acknowledgement, the underlying message that seemed to say, "You're just here to serve." I could feel the quiet ache growing inside me. My hands suddenly felt cold, though I wasn't sure if it was the words or the sudden realization of my place in the family that made me shiver. I had spent years nurturing my son, helping Maria settle into our family, and now I was nothing more than an invisible fixture. Someone to clean up after the fun was over. Someone to fade into the background while everyone else enjoyed their time. The tension in the room was subtle, but it was there, lingering in the air like a dark cloud. I glanced around at the happy faces, the easy conversations, but the more I looked, the more I felt like I didn't belong. I wasn't part of the laughter. I wasn't part of the easy affection. I was just the one who cleaned up the mess. And yet, I stayed silent. I didn't voice my hurt or express my feelings. Instead, I quietly stood up from the table and began to gather the plates. My movements were mechanical, each step deliberate as I removed the uneaten food and cleared the table. I wanted to scream, to ask why I wasn't considered as important as Maria's mother, but I didn't. I just couldn't. The act of cleaning up was so simple, but in that moment, it felt like I was washing away all the years I had spent as a mother, as a wife, and as a part of this family. I wasn't being asked to help. I was being told to do something, expected to do it without question, without thanks. As I moved to the kitchen, I fought back the tears that threatened to fall. I had spent so much of my life giving everything to this family, and now, here, I was, in the kitchen, invisible. But the worst part wasn't the task itself. It was the realization that I had been slowly forgotten. The meal was set, and everyone sat down at the table to eat. The conversation flowed easily, with everyone laughing and sharing stories. Maria's mother seemed to be the center of attention, basking in the warmth of the gathering as my son, Alex, made sure she had everything she needed. I watched from the sidelines, barely participating in the lively conversation. Maria's mother was enjoying the attention, and Maria herself was a picture of perfect hospitality, constantly checking on her mom, offering more food, more wine, and engaging in small talk with such ease. It was like a scene from a movie, where everything appeared picture-perfect on the outside. But for me, the perfection felt like a cruel joke. I smiled, nodded, and listened. But every word, every laugh, every glass of wine that was poured added weight to the silent ache in my chest. It wasn't the laughter that bothered me. It wasn't even the wine or the way Maria focused on her mother with such care. It was the underlying truth I had come to realize. I had become invisible. I had always been the one to keep the family together, the one who held everything together. Through the years, but now I was being reduced to nothing more than a caretaker, a servant in my own home. Maria's attention was fully absorbed by her mother, and it stung. I had always believed that I was a part of the core of this family, but now I was being made to feel as if I were nothing more than a peripheral figure. There was a time when I had been the one who was the center of attention at these family meals, the one who made everyone laugh, the one who ensured everyone felt loved and cared for. But now, it seemed as if that role had been handed over to someone else, and I was being asked to simply fade into the background. I watched as Maria poured her mother another glass of wine, and as she fussed over her, making sure she was comfortable. The sight made my stomach twist. Maria was clearly happy to have her mother's company, but there was no acknowledgement of me, no sense of gratitude or respect for all I had done for this family. There was no recognition of the many years I had spent cooking, cleaning, and raising my son. My presence had become a formality, like a background character in someone else's story. I realized with a heavy heart that I was no longer seen as a vital part of this family. I excused myself from the table under the guise of helping with the cleanup, but the truth was, I couldn't bear to sit there any longer. As I entered the kitchen, I tried to push aside the overwhelming emotions that threatened to surface. The plates were stacked high, the remnants of the meal sitting cold and untouched. I took a deep breath and started to wash the dishes, each plate feeling heavier than the last. The sound of water running from the faucet felt louder than it ever had before, like a soundtrack to my growing sense of isolation. The task was monotonous, almost mechanical. I scrubbed and rinsed, my mind elsewhere, replaying the events that had unfolded over the past few months. It wasn't just about the dishes. It was about the way I was being treated, the way my presence seemed to be an afterthought. I thought back to the time when I had been a central figure in this family. There was a time when I was the one who comforted, who made sure everyone felt safe and loved. But now, that role had shifted, and I had been left behind, standing in the shadows, unnoticed. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. As I stood there, scrubbing away at the dishes, I tried to push back the hurt that threatened to overwhelm me. I couldn't understand why things had changed. Why had I become so unimportant in my own home? I had always been the one who kept the family together, but now I felt like I was being discarded. My son was too absorbed in his wife's family to notice the way I was feeling. Maria, too, seemed to be caught up in her own world. No one saw what I was going through. No one seemed to care. The emotional weight of it all began to settle on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I was deeply hurt. It was a quiet, lingering ache that grew with each passing moment, each glass of wine poured, each laugh shared between Maria and her mother. I was slowly fading into the background, and the family I had dedicated my life to was slipping through my fingers, one small act at a time. As the final dish was washed and dried, I stood there for a moment, looking at the sink full of clean plates, the product of my labor. I had done this countless times before, without complaint, without expectation. But today, something felt different. It wasn't just the task that had exhausted me. It was the realization that I had become invisible in the eyes of the people I loved the most. They had moved on, leaving me behind in the kitchen, left to wash the dishes while they shared their lives without me. I was left alone in the kitchen, with only the sound of my own breathing for company. As the evening wore on, I could feel my heart becoming heavier with every passing minute. The clinking of wine glasses and the cheerful banter between Maria and her mother filled the air, but it only seemed to deepen the sense of loneliness I felt. I watched them, their closeness evident in every smile, every touch, every shared joke. And there I was, standing off to the side, a silent observer, my presence seemingly forgotten. It wasn't just the dishes anymore. It was the realization that I had become an outsider in my own family. The woman who had nurtured this family, who had sacrificed so much over the years, was now nothing more than an invisible figure. The tension had been building all evening. It wasn't just in the way I was treated, but in the way Maria seemed to have taken on a role that didn't leave much room for anyone else, certainly not for me. I had always understood that she was close to her mother, and I had never been jealous of that bond. But tonight felt different. Maria had made sure her mother was comfortable, constantly offering her more wine, more food, and more attention. Yet, when it came time to acknowledge me, to recognize my contribution to this family, I was met with nothing but silence. As the meal came to an end, I began to clear the table. My movements were slow and deliberate, each dish feeling heavier than the last. Maria's voice broke through my thoughts. "Mom, do you want another glass of wine?" she asked with a smile. Her mother nodded enthusiastically, and Maria wasted no time in filling her glass. The gesture seemed small, but to me it felt like a slap in the face. Maria was so focused on making her mother comfortable, ensuring she had everything she needed. Yet she hadn't once considered that I might need something too. A simple thank you, a small acknowledgement would have been enough, but instead I was expected to just clean up after everyone as though I didn't have feelings, as though I was invisible. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. My emotions, which I had been holding back all evening, finally began to surface. It wasn't the wine or the attention Maria was giving her mother that hurt me. It was the quiet disregard for everything I had done for this family. The sacrifices, the years of taking care of them, the love I had poured into every meal, every act of care, every moment spent building this family from the ground up. None of that seemed to matter anymore. I was nothing more than an afterthought. Tried to push the feelings aside, but they were too overwhelming. The quiet ache that had been building all evening slowly transformed into anger. I had given my heart and soul to this family, and this disregard, was the thanks I received. I stood there, watching as Maria filled her mother's glass again, and I felt something inside me snap. Without thinking, I put the dish I was washing down and stepped away from the sink. I needed to get out. I needed to leave, to clear my head, to escape the suffocating feeling of being unnoticed. As I walked away, I heard Maria's voice calling out behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't turn back. The cool air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I breathed in deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't want to cry, didn't want to let the hurt show, but it was impossible to ignore. I had spent so many years caring for this family, giving everything I had, and now it felt as if I was nothing more than a servant, expected to do the chores and fade into the background. Maria, my daughter-in-law, had taken the place I once held, and I was left to wash dishes while she lavished attention on her own mother. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years being the glue that held everything together, and now I was being pushed aside. I walked through the quiet neighborhood, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I wasn't angry at Maria's mother. She hadn't done anything wrong. But it was hard to ignore the stark contrast between the way Maria treated her and the way she treated me. It wasn't just about the dishes. It was about respect. It was about acknowledgement. And it was about love. The kind of love that I had always given freely to my family, but which now seemed to be reserved for others. As I walked, I reflected on all the years I had spent nurturing and caring for this family. I had always been there, supporting them, encouraging them, and loving them. But now, as I walked alone in the darkening streets, I couldn't help but wonder if that love had been taken for granted. Had they forgotten everything I had done for them? Had I been so caught up in giving that I had forgotten to take care of myself? The weight of these questions pressed heavily on my chest. I had been the backbone of this family, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly, the one who kept the peace. But tonight, I was nothing more than an invisible figure in the background, and that realization cut deeper than I could put into words. I didn't know how long I had been walking. The cool night air felt like a balm against my anger, but the hurt still lingered. I didn't know what to do, or how to fix things. All I knew was that I couldn't go back inside, not yet. I needed time to process everything. Time to figure out where I stood in this family, and whether it was even worth fighting for. The cool evening air bit at my skin as I walked through the quiet neighborhood, each step bringing me farther away. From the house, from the people who had once meant everything to me. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. The city streets were empty, and the world around me felt silent, as though it was giving me space to breathe, to think. My thoughts were swirling in a chaotic mess, each one feeding the growing storm inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been forgotten, dismissed, and that tonight I had finally reached my breaking point. The darkness of the night enveloped me as I walked, and with each step, I felt further removed from the home I had worked so hard to build. I had spent my life creating a family, pouring love and care into every aspect of it. But now, it felt like that very family had moved on without me. I wasn't just upset with Maria. I was disappointed in myself. How had I let it get to this point? How had I allowed myself to become so invisible? I tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming, one after another. I thought about the years I had spent raising my son, supporting my husband, and caring for the home. I thought about all the meals I had cooked, all the nights I had stayed up late tending to the needs of the family, and how, over the years, I had been taken for granted. I wasn't asking for recognition or praise, but the simple acknowledgement that I had a place in this family, that I wasn't just a figure who appeared when it was convenient, but instead, there I was, walking aimlessly through the streets, feeling like a stranger in my own life. As I walked, I could feel the weight of the emotions pressing down on me. There was sadness, yes, but also a deep sense of loss. It wasn't just the loss of recognition, it was the loss of the role I had played in this family. I had given so much, and now it felt like all my sacrifices had been for nothing. I had raised my son with love and care, watching him grow into the man he was today. But somewhere along the way, I had faded into the background, unnoticed and unimportant. I walked past familiar streets, past the homes of neighbors who knew me as a mother, as a wife, but to whom I was little more than a passing acquaintance. The world seemed to move on without me. It was as if everyone else had their lives, their families, and I was just a bystander in my own existence. I longed for the days when I felt connected, when I knew my place in this world. But those days seemed so far away now, lost in the shadows of what I had become. I reached the park after what felt like hours of walking. It was quiet there, the trees casting long, dark shadows across the empty benches and walking paths. I found a bench at the edge of the park and sat down, the cool air rushing over me as I looked up at the sky. The stars were barely visible, obscured by the city lights, but I still found comfort in the vastness of the night. It was a reminder that there was more to the world than just the small, painful bubble I had created around myself. I sat there, for a while, lost in my thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was hurt. It wasn't just about the wine, or the dishes, or the way Maria had ignored me. It was about how I had been treated over the years. It was the little things, the subtle ways in which I had been pushed aside until I no longer felt needed or wanted. I had spent so much of my life giving, always giving, and now it seemed like no one cared enough to give anything back. The loneliness I felt in that moment was overwhelming. I had always prided myself on being strong, on being the one who held everything together. But now, I felt broken. I felt as though the very foundation of who I was had been shattered, leaving me with nothing but the shards of what had once been a solid, dependable life. I wondered if I had been foolish to give so much of myself to others without asking for anything in return. Maybe I had allowed myself to become too dependent on the idea of family, on the idea of being needed. A small part of me wondered if I had failed my son, if I had somehow taught him that it was okay to overlook the people who had always been there for him. I didn't want to blame Maria. She was just doing what she knew. And maybe, in some ways, I had made it too easy for her to step into the role I had once played. But that didn't make it any less painful. It didn't change the fact that I was standing on the outside looking in, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I stayed in the park for what felt like hours, my mind spinning with regret, frustration, and sadness. Finally, I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting too long, and began to walk back home. The night had grown colder, and I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth. The walk had not given me any answers, but it had given me something else: clarity. I didn't have to accept being invisible. I didn't have to accept being pushed aside. I deserved more than that, and maybe it was time for me to make my voice heard again. When I reached the door of the house, I stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep walking away. I needed to face this, face my family, face my feelings, and start the process of rebuilding what had been lost. It wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to take that first step. The next morning, after a long and restless night, I awoke to a stillness in the house. It wasn't the usual warmth and activity that I had grown accustomed to. Instead, it felt empty, as though everything I had been through the night before had drained all the life from the air. I was unsure what to expect when I returned home, after my walk, uncertain if I would face more silence, more awkwardness, or whether something would finally shift. I had spent the entire night thinking about how things had gotten to this point, and the ache in my chest wouldn't leave. But, despite the lingering hurt, I knew that I couldn't allow myself to stay in this state forever. As I walked downstairs, I noticed Alex sitting in the kitchen, his expression heavy with concern. The moment I entered the room, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and worry. "Mom," he began softly, his voice tinged with an emotion I hadn't heard from him in years. "We need to talk." I had been bracing myself for this moment, knew that it would come eventually. But even so, when it happened, I was unprepared for the wave of emotions that surged through me. I sat down at the kitchen table, feeling the exhaustion from the previous night's emotional turmoil still weighing heavily on me. Alex looked at me, taking a deep breath as if gathering his thoughts before speaking again. "I'm sorry," he said, his words simple but sincere. "I didn't realize how much this has been affecting you. Last night, I saw it. I saw how hurt you were, and I should have noticed earlier. But I didn't. I was so focused on everything else, on Maria's family, and I completely overlooked how you were feeling." I was silent for a moment, taken aback by his apology. He had never been one to open up like this, to admit his shortcomings. It felt like the first time in a long time that my son saw me, really saw me, not just as his mother, but as a person with her own needs and feelings. "I've been so caught up with Maria's family lately," Alex continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I've let that distance grow between us, and it was wrong. I didn't mean to make you feel like you didn't matter, because you do. You've always mattered." He paused, looking at me with deep remorse. "I've been blind, and I'm sorry." The sincerity in his eyes was enough to make my heart swell. It wasn't just the apology itself. It was the realization that my son was finally hearing me. He was finally understanding the pain I had been carrying for so long. It wasn't easy to admit, but this moment was everything I had hoped for. It was the first step in the healing process. I had spent so many years giving, sacrificing, and caring for this family. And now, in this small moment, I was starting to feel like I mattered again. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few days lifting just a little. I didn't want to cause a scene, I said quietly. I didn't want you to feel like I was trying to come between you and Maria. But I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I felt invisible. It hurt. It still hurts. Alex nodded, his eyes full of understanding. I get it, Mom. I should have noticed sooner, and I promise I'll do better. You deserve to be seen, to be respected. I'll talk to Maria about everything and we'll fix this. I'll make sure she understands how important you are to this family. His words were comforting, but I knew that this wasn't something that could be solved overnight. Relationships, especially family ones, were complex. But in that moment, I realized that this was the start of something new, a chance for me to rebuild the connection I had with my son, and hopefully, with Maria, as well. As Alex stood up to leave, he turned back to look at me, a soft smile on his face. Thank you, Mom, for being patient with me. We'll make things right. His words filled me with a bittersweet sense of hope. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but in that moment, I felt like I had been heard. I had been seen. And that, more than anything, was all I had ever wanted. Later that afternoon, Maria approached me. She seemed unsure of herself, her usual confidence replaced by a more vulnerable demeanor. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, she began, her voice trembling slightly. But I want to apologize too. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you. I got so caught up in everything else, and I never stopped to think about how you were feeling. Her words took me by surprise. Maria, who had always been so independent and strong-willed, was now standing before me, genuinely apologizing. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from her, and I appreciated it more than I could express. She took a deep breath before continuing. I've always been close to my mom, and I never meant to make you feel like you were less important. But I understand now. I should have been more mindful of your feelings. You've done so much for me, for Alex, for this family. And I took that for granted. I'm sorry. Her apology wasn't easy for her to say, and I could see the weight of it in her eyes. Thank you, Maria, I replied softly, my voice filled with emotion. It means a lot to hear you say that. I just want us to be a family again. I want to feel like I belong, like I'm a part of it. Maria nodded, and we stood there for a moment, the silence between us filled with a new understanding. It wouldn't be easy to fix everything overnight, but this was a start, a step toward healing, toward rebuilding the bond that had been broken. In the days that followed, things began to change. Slowly but surely, Maria and I started to communicate more openly, and Alex made an effort to be present, to be involved in both our lives. The tension that had once defined our relationship started to dissipate, replaced by a sense of mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. The family I had once feared losing was slowly coming back together, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was no longer invisible. I mattered. Again, a few days after Maria's heartfelt apology and Alex's promise to do better, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. Things weren't perfect yet. There was still some awkwardness in the air, and I could feel that both Maria and Alex were being more careful around me, as if walking on eggshells. But I noticed the small changes. They were listening more, paying attention to my needs, and acknowledging my presence in a way that I hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in a while, I began to feel like I was part of the family again. It wasn't until one quiet evening, when everything seemed to settle into a rhythm of normalcy, that the real turning point came. We were sitting together in the living room. Maria and her mother were deep in conversation, while Alex and I sat off to the side talking casually. The atmosphere felt light, comfortable even. There were still moments where the previous tensions crept back into my mind, but for the most part, we were a family again, trying to rebuild what had been broken. Then came the moment that completely changed everything. I had been sitting quietly, my eyes drifting over the room, when Maria suddenly turned to me. Her face was slightly flushed, her posture a bit stiff, and there was a nervous energy around her that caught my attention. "Mom," she said, her voice hesitant but sincere, "I think it's time we talked about what happened. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I want to make things right." I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the hesitation in her words, and it made my heart race a little. I had already seen so much growth in her over the past few days, and yet this moment felt like the final step in healing the rift between us. I nodded, encouraging her to go on, my curiosity piqued. I didn't just treat you unfairly," Maria began, her voice trembling slightly. "I took you for granted. I've always been so focused on impressing my mom and making sure everything was perfect for her that I never stopped to think about how you felt. I made you feel invisible, like your needs didn't matter. And for that, I'm so sorry." Her words hit me like a wave, and I struggled to keep my composure. Part of me wanted to hold back, to guard myself from the pain of the past, but another part of me was overwhelmed by the genuine remorse in her voice. I could see that this wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of the hurt I had felt, the years of sacrifice that had gone unnoticed. It was a rare and powerful moment of vulnerability from Maria, and it left me speechless. "I've been thinking about it," Maria continued, her eyes locked with mine. "And I realized that I wasn't just wrong about how I treated you. I was wrong about my expectations, about the way I saw our relationship. I want to fix things. I want you to feel like you matter, because you do." At that moment, it felt like the world paused. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was still hurt, still carrying the weight of the last few months. But there was also a part of me that wanted to let go, to embrace this new understanding. I had waited for this moment for so long, the moment when Maria would finally see me, truly see me, as more than just the woman who cleaned up after everyone. "I didn't expect an apology, Maria," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "But hearing this, it means the world to me. I just want you to know that I've always been here, doing what I could, and hoping that you would understand. You're part of my family, and I've always wanted to be a part of yours." She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand now, Mom. I understand how much you've given and how much you've done for us. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." For a moment, we sat there, the weight of the conversation hanging between us. But the air felt lighter somehow. There was a sense of relief, as though we had both exhaled at the same time, letting go of the tension that had built up over the past few months. It was in that quiet, vulnerable moment that I realized something else, something deeper. This wasn't just about Maria's apology or Alex's promise to do better. This was about me, too. I had been holding on to my own hurt, my own feelings of being overlooked and unappreciated, and I had let that pain fester. I had allowed myself to become consumed by the idea that I didn't matter, that I was invisible. But Maria's words, her genuine remorse, helped me see something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. I did matter. I was important to this family, and they finally saw that. As the conversation wound down, Alex came over to join us, and Maria reached out to him, pulling him into the moment. We sat together as a family, talking softly, sharing our thoughts and feelings. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were all on the same page, that the walls that had divided us were finally starting to crumble. There were still challenges ahead, but in that moment, I realized that we had taken the first real step toward healing. As the evening went on, I found myself smiling, not out of force, but because I could feel the change in the air. Maria and Alex were listening, truly listening, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was seen, not just as a mother or a wife, but as a person worthy of love and respect. The revelation wasn't just about what Maria had said. It was about the realization that my family was still capable of growth, of change. It was about the realization that after all the pain and heartache, we could still come together and rebuild what had been broken. And that, for me, was worth everything.